Hey nerdy knitters! Last summer I knit a sweater in a cotton hemp blend yarn. The pattern I chose was adorable, a great pattern, but the yarn I chose to go with that pattern, not so great. Because of the fiber content, it's a heavy yarn, doesn't have much elasticity, and it tends to sag and droop. And because the pattern has a really open neckline, the more I wore it, the more that neckline would sag and droop, and it was actually getting a little bit indecent. So my plan is to reclaim the yarn from this sweater and knit something else that's more suitable for this type of yarn. I've actually already started and cast on because I had a little bit of yarn left over last summer. But if you're interested in that pattern, I'll link to the video where I talk about it at the end of this video. But in today's video, we're going to talk about a thrifty way to reclaim yarn and knit new sweaters by digging out the things that you no longer wear and reusing that yarn. Now, the first step in this process is to actually unravel the sweater. And if it's a hand knit sweater, think about how it was constructed. You're going to unravel it in the reverse order. So where I knit from the top down, I'm going to unravel from that bottom part, from where the bind off is, and unravel it to the top. So if you've knit something from the top down, then you're going to start at the bottom and unravel it. You start at your bind off point. So if you've worked something in pieces, but you worked from the bottom to the top, you're going to undo those seams along the shoulders, separate those pieces, and then unwind that garment from the shoulders down to the hem. So if it's a sweater that you have already knit and you know which direction it was knit, then you just start in the opposite direction. Basically, wherever you bound off, that's where you unpick and you start unraveling. Now you have two choices here. If you can find the tail, you can just like unpick it and then pick out that bind off row and unravel. But if you don't mind losing a bit of yarn, you can actually just trim off the bind off row. Now, of course, you can do this by hand. The first time I did this with a sweater from the secondhand store, I did it by hand. And that's a long process though. So a ball winder and a swift are very helpful for this step and the next step. But while you're unraveling, a ball winder is nice because it can do all of the work for you. So you don't have to constantly be pulling at that sweater and wrapping it around your hand. And then sometimes you might run into places where the yarn was split. So you'll have to make a judgment call whether you want to break the ball of yarn at that point, remove that split section and then start a new ball. Or if it's not split too bad, if you can just gently pull apart that one ply that might be involved and then just keep going. It's really a judgment call about how it's split. And you'll also run into tail weaves when you've joined a new ball of yarn. You'll have to stop and pick those out too. Or you can just cut a bit of yarn right there and then restart with a new ball. So if you're unraveling a hand knit sweater, this process is fairly simple because you know how you knit that garment. But you can also do this process with sweaters that are factory made or machine knit, but it takes a little bit more work to decipher the right types of garments. Now, the garments you'll want to avoid are pieces that were cut out of knit fabric and then sewn together, because you're going to have one strand of yarn and then another strand of yarn for the next row, and then another strand. They're not connected into one continuous strand. So when you look at those seams, if you see that it looks like they've been cut and sewn together, then that's not a good sweater to unravel. But the type of garment you want to look for that is machine made is pieces that are individually made and then attached or sewn together, and it looks like a little crochet seam along the inside. Each of those pieces were individually made and not just cut out of fabric. So it will be like a continuous strand of yarn along like the front of that fabric. So usually these are done in pieces and sewn together. So you're going to have to find, I like to start at the shoulders and I just cut the shoulder seams off and then I start unraveling until I can get a continuous strand of yarn. Now, hand knit sweaters are obviously going to be easier for this process because you can tell where your cast on and bind off rows are, but it's not impossible with factory made sweaters. It just takes a little more effort. It can be worth it, especially if you're thrifty, because you can go to the secondhand store and find lots of sweaters that you can unravel and reuse that yarn. Now before we get to step 2, if you're liking this video and finding it helpful, do you mind giving it a thumbs up so it can reach more knitters? I would really appreciate it. Now when you've reached the end of that unraveling process, and I know it takes a long time, especially if it's a machine-made sweater, the next step is to refresh that yarn. Now obviously you can skip this, you can knit straight from those balls of yarn that you've made, but they're not that fun to knit with, and the fabric that you end up with doesn't look that great because the yarn's already been used, so it's in all these little kinks and curls, and you want to smooth it out as much as possible to make it easier to knit with. So the best way to do this is to take those balls of yarn and put them onto a yarn swift and turn them back into hanks. And if you don't have a yarn swift, you can find somebody with an extra pair of hands or the back of a chair and do this same process. You just want to get it into a hank so you can soak it. Now, when it is in that final hank, you're going to tie an 8-figure knot in about 4 places because you don't want your yarn to move around too much. It can get tangled up and really become a mess if it moves too much. Then you just want to give it a nice bath. Put it in a basin full of cool to lukewarm water and let it have a nice good soak. I let it soak for about 30 minutes or even up to an hour. Then when it's soaked, you can remove it from the water and squeeze out the excess. You could even roll it up in a towel to squeeze out more water if you want, and then just hang it up to dry. Then after it is dry, you can cake it up again and it's ready to cast on for the next project. Now that I've reclaimed the yarn from this sweater and I'm starting a new tank top for the summer, if you'd like to see what I'm knitting, check out this video. It's filled with ideas for tank tops and summer tees that you might want to knit, along with the one that I chose to knit to add to my summer wardrobe. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.